Well, 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 we have the Jews and the Arabs fighting each other over in Israel again, and frankly, I I don't want to care about Israel. I don't, on a fundamental basis, I don't care about Israel, but unfortunately, Israel cares a lot about me and everyone else. The U.S. media, the entire establishment wants me as an American to care a lot about Israel and to pay attention every time there is a big flare-up in conflict like this, and only, of course, I'm supposed to side 100% with whatever the Israelis have to say, and just take whatever their side of the story is as gospel. Now, unfortunately, I don't do that. It's just not my thing. I'm not going to take the Israeli side and just go, oh, okay, yep, whatever Bibi says, that's probably the truth. I'm not going to do that. The problem here is that I can't take much of a position myself, though. I'm not going to come out and say, okay, Bibi's 100% right, because he never is, for obvious reasons. When you have a conflict, neither side is going to tell you the full truth. You have to kind of compare both and then try and find out what neither of them are saying and figure out what the truth is. And in this case, there's just not enough information. But based on what I've seen in the past, based on what we know about the history of this conflict between Jews and Arabs in the Holy Land, in what is called Israel or Palestine. I will not say Israel and Palestine because they are synonyms. They mean the same thing. Whether someone says Israel or Palestine is a political decision. Israel, of course, is the Jewish name for that land. The Romans came in and they called it Palestine after the Philistines because they didn't like the Jews. This is commonly understood history. The names mean the exact same thing, so I'm not gonna pretend like they're two separate things. I'm not gonna talk about the Israelis and the Palestinians. I've always found that dichotomy to be very strange, especially when there's very interesting research, which has suggested that the so-called Palestinians of today are in fact the descendants of the old Israeli Jews who were conquered by the Romans and weren't driven out, because it's pretty much a historical a commonly accepted historical fact that not all the Jews were forced out of Israel, out of Judea or Palestine or whatever you want to call it. A lot of them stayed and just converted and assimilated to become Romans. But again, I'm getting off on a tangent here about this whole this multi-millennia conflict. I forget, this goes back thousands of years. This is some heavy stuff for me to just go over in a friggin' YouTube video, or let alone a 5-minute segment on CNN or Fox News or something. But the basic gist of what's going on right now is that the Israelis were planning to evict, I guess, 40 families somewhere in East Jerusalem. I forget the name of the neighborhood. It was Sheikh something or other. And when I hear that the Israelis are going to evict some Palestinians, my spidey senses start tingling, because this is kind of the origin of the whole conflict between the Jews and the Arabs in this part of the world. Is that it started back during the time of the Ottoman Empire. The first Zionists started moving to what is today Israel, and they started evicting Arabs. Now, the way that they accomplished this is that they went to the Ottoman lords, essentially, and purchased the land. These Ottomans, these were guys over in Turkey, probably, who lived in Constantinople, and never really attended to their holdings over in the Middle East. And so they were very happy to take some money from these European Jews who wanted to purchase it from them. And so, but they never really did much to manage it, and so they were hardly landlords at all. They didn't, they had no real claim, and they probably obtained the land not through purchasing, but through when the Turks originally conquered the land, and then it was probably passed down through generations that way. So I mean, it was, to me, the ownership claims of these absentee Turkish landlords who the Israelis were purchasing title deeds from were tenuous at best, as far as I'm concerned. And that's why when the Jews started moving to Israel or Palestine, although at the time it was definitely called Palestine, that was the common name still. There was the name that the Romans gave it stuck around, and it was still in common use at that time. And so when the Jews started moving to Palestine, they were saying, "Hey, we're not going to renew your lease. It's time to get up. You can't farm here anymore. We're going to live here, and we only, if we're going to rent to anybody, either we're going to farm it ourselves or we're going to rent to other Jews." And these people who had, lived there for generations, for thousands of years, if you as some studies that have tried to trace back, their DNA and stuff of these people who live in these villages, they've been there forever, and so a lot of them were pretty pissed off that these guys were coming over from Europe and saying, "Ooh, I own this land now, and you got to go," because these so-called tenants who were being evicted by the Jewish people who had recently purchased this land from some Ottoman aristocrat, they had much more of a, in my opinion, a legitimate claim to ownership over this land than the guy that the Jewish guys, the Jewish Zionists had bought this land from. And a lot of the Zionists, I think you can forgive them for saying, well, I just paid good money to buy this land, and so it's mine. What are you mad at me for if I don't want to renew your lease? And that's kind of how this all got started. And that's still what's going on today. And so when I hear the Israelis are trying to evict some Palestinians, I hear that same kind of, that same sort of problem of, you have people who have been living in these areas for generations and generations, now all of a sudden being told that they have to leave. And they, I think rightfully, pretty obvious if you look at it, look at the situation, they rightfully feel like they should not have to leave and that this is their home. And so when you come in and you attack someone in their home and tell them they have to leave, they're going to stand and fight. That's a very basic human instinct. That's why this conflict has been so brutal and so vicious and has dragged on for so long, because people do not want to leave their homes. And so do I really want to care a whole lot about what's going on in Israel? Not really, but if the media is going to force me to talk about it, if they're going to force me to hear about it, I'm not going to just come out and say, "Oh, poor Bibi," or the poor Israelis, they're being attacked again by those naughty Arabs. Because, you can't expect to have a stable, peaceful society without the basic foundation of stable property rights. If the Palestinians are not secure in their property rights, well, then as a people, they're not going to be stable. They're always going to be sort of under, constant threat of eviction, which is, what the Israelis have kept them under for all this time. I mean, if you want the Palestinians to settle down, one, stop kicking them out of their homes, and two, set it down in law and make it clear that they actually own their homes. But of course, the Israelis don't want to do this because the Israelis, generally speaking, a lot of them don't feel like that these Arabs have the right to own this property. I mean, it depends. There's always a spectrum when it comes to these Zionists on how zealous they are or not. But a lot of Zionists, it's not a very it's not an unpopular idea that the right to own all the land in Israel is, it's the Jewish people's birthright. And so to them, it's sort of an a priori truth that these non-Jews do not have a legitimate ownership claim over any of this land that is within, the area that the Jews claim ownership to. It's sort of mixing private property rights with ideas of nationalism, I guess. I think that the sort of the core problem here is that Jewish nationalism, as applied by the Israelis, nullifies the private property rights of non-Jews. Now, over time, there have been some Arabs who've been allowed to become citizens of Israel, and they like to brag about that and say, well, an Arab has a lot more rights in Israel than they do in any of these Arab countries. And it's a fair point. It's not a fair point in that, well, a lot of the Palestinian activists now are to the point to where they're saying, hey, Israel, why don't you just make us citizens? If you're not going to give us our own country, if you're not going to, if you're not going to, stop occupying Gaza and the West Bank, and you're not going to give us independence as a separate country, just make us citizens. And the reason why the Israelis don't want to do that, and why the Israelis, only have a 20%, only 20% of or so of Israeli citizens are Arabs, is because the Israelis do not want to be only a slim majority or God forbid a minority in the Jewish state. The Jewish state kind of has to be Jewish, and that means that the super duper majority of their citizens need to be Jews. And so they have a problem with all these people who are within the borders that they want to claim, who they don't want to make citizens, because if all of these, if all these Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel were made citizens of Israel, and Israel just annexed all the land, they annexed Gaza, and they annexed the rest of the West Bank, what the Jews like to call Judea and Samaria, they could probably do that tomorrow, but they would have to make all these people citizens. If they did that, well, they'd have to deal with them voting, and these people would have property rights, and they would have, legal rights. And this is just stuff that, the very much pro-Israel media in the United States, which, conservatives love to talk about how much the mainstream media hates Israel, which is ridiculous. I mean, the most mildest of criticisms maybe, is enough for them to label CNN as an anti-Semitic network. Hell, you have the New York Post, which is a Murdoch paper, I believe, mixed up the death toll. They talked about, oh my gosh, these Palestinians fired off all these rockets and killed 20 Israelis, including 9 children. And it turned out, oh, whoops, we messed up. We got that backwards. It was the Israelis who killed, in their airstrikes, 20 Palestinians, including 9 children. So it's a really sad situation. I feel bad, really, really bad, for anyone who is born into that small little part of the world, in those little dots of the West Bank that are not, Israel, or into Gaza. If you're born there, you really don't have a shot in life, because you can't do much. The economy there is obviously not in great shape. You don't have property rights, which again, that is the fundamental problem with everything. If you don't have well delineated and enforced private property rights, you can't. There's no way to build a civilization on top of a foundation of quicksand, where nothing is solid, where nothing is consistent. Where how do you build a business if you can't be clear that you own the building that you're working in? How can you raise a family if today? Sure, you have a house, but tomorrow the Israelis come in and decide, no, you don't own this house. You never owned a house. Get out of here, and they mow it down. And again, if the Israel First crowd doesn't like me asking these questions, then I just ask them to, quit bringing up Israel so much. I don't want to talk about it. I don't care about it. If Israel, or if I was not compelled to care about Israel, I would go through and probably talk about Israel occasionally, just like I do all these other countries where bad things happen, just like I talked about Armenia and Azerbaijan, just like I've talked about Yemen, and actually even Yemen. The only reason I talked so much about Yemen in the past is because my government's involved with it, and so it's of particular concern to me. But most of these other places where my government is not involved, I don't really care. And, of course, my government is quite involved in Israel and propping up Israel. But at least these are not American troops going over there and committing these acts and being directly involved in combat. I mean, Israel is plenty capable militarily. So that's my 2 cents on the situation in Israel. It's a sad situation. I'm not going to come out and, I've never been one of these people who have come out and could be, 100%, I love the Palestinians kind of person. I pity them, or I shouldn't say that. Pity is sort of pity is diminutive. I don't mean to pity them. I mean that I sympathize with them, but at the same time, I can't come out and say, like, I'm 100% on their team because, as far as a civilization goes, it's a very different culture that I don't, I think one of the reasons why it's so easy for Israel to sell itself to the U.S. is because Israel is a Western country. It was, it's very much a colonial nation, even though they don't like to call themselves. So they're a colonial nation like the U.S. Is, or like Australia is. They brought Western values to the Middle East, which had a very different kind of society prior to modern Zionism. And so the society that the Zionists have constructed in Israel is much more akin to something that we would recognize here in the West, and something that we would feel comfortable with. Whereas anyone who, in the West who would look at the Palestinians, would look at them and extrapolate that, well, based on the way the rest of the Middle East looks, if the Palestinians were to prevail in this conflict over the Israelis, the society in that country would look much more like the rest of the Middle East, which is, not something that Americans and a lot of other people in the West, particularly the Anglosphere, look at very favorably. Of course, I do believe that prior to the Israelis gaining influence, that there was a much bigger proportion of Christians in what was Palestine than there is today. I think as of now, all of the non-Jews in that area, only about 20% of them are Christians, and they are given just as much trouble as the Muslims are. Which is something that, you never see American Zionists pay much attention to, which is strange considering that American Zionists, the most passionate ones, are, ardent Christians. They're not so much ardent Jews. There's a lot more Christian Zionists by a pretty substantial margin in the United States than there are Jewish Zionists. But there I am getting off topic again. So I think that's about all I have to say on this issue. I don't want to go rambling on too much, but I think you get the gist. I don't want to have to talk about this, but from time to time I have to. And the fundamental issue to take away from here is that it's not black and white. No, the Israelis are not the angels that most of the media paint them as, but the Palestinians are not. I wouldn't say are. I can't go as far as the pro-Palestinian folks do in praising them and defending them. I think that unquestionably they are the victims in this scenario, but that doesn't mean that I can 100% endorse them as a group. And I was trying to get at this earlier, but when it talks about people when I was talking about how people sort of gravitate towards in conflicts like this, one group or another, and why most Americans are going to gravitate towards the Israelis, it's because of familiar society. You have that same sort of effect when it comes to a historical conflict, Rhodesia, people in the Anglosphere, U.S., Australia, Britain, whatever, tended to gravitate towards the Rhodesians and against the Zimbabweans. Kind of a similar thing. You have people using two names for the same country, who sort of claim to be the true, the true heirs to the land. And then, of course, there were the troubles in Northern Ireland. Americans largely, because of the large Irish Catholic presence in America. If there was any American who cared about Ireland, they probably were going to side with the IRA. Even though Americans are overwhelmingly Protestant, American Christians, that is, Catholics have always been a minority here. Of the people who cared about Ireland, it was going to be people of Irish descent who were overwhelmingly Catholic. And despite that, the Irish Protestants, the Scotch Irish, they they did try to appeal to their American brethren. It's just that in terms of political clout, your Scotch-Irish Americans were not as politically active or aware or as powerful as a group. Then, of course, you have the conflict with Armenia. A lot of Armenian Americans, overwhelmingly, people in America, are going to side with the Armenians over the Turks in the battle over the recognition of the Armenian genocide. But all these things that I've talked about, whether it's Armenia, Ireland, Rhodesia, all of these are issues that were very minor in terms of American politics, not even a blip really. Because Americans generally don't care about the rest of the world. They do not think much about the rest of the world. They have very sort of short thoughts about the rest of the world, even about a place like Israel. But Israel is the only country outside the U.S. to where Americans really become fixated on its issues. Which is strange. I mean, you would expect it more of a country like Ireland that Americans would be more concerned about because there are so many people in this country of Irish descent. Or Italy. You would think that, there would be a lot of people who were, in World War II, there might be a lot of guys who were sort of second-guessing whether they should join the army and go and fight Mussolini because, I mean, that's their family over there. So I'm not really going anywhere with this, but it's an interesting thing to think about, how weird it is how much we talk about Israel here in this country, and the way in which the Israeli perspective is presented in such a not monolithic, but I guess monopolistic way. There is no real perspective outside of whatever the official narrative is. So, with that said, I've gone on way too long about this topic, way longer than I wanted to talk about it, so I'll leave it there.